Hello and welcome back to another GiantSlayer TFT Synergies Tier List video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S down to the D tier. Much like 10.9, this patch has a diverse meta with a lot of traits being viable. Due to that, there's not actually much of a gap in power between each tier, so keep that in mind. With that said, let's get into it. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our GiantSlayer TFT social media pages. To kick things off, we've got S tier, which consists of Mercenary, Valkyrie, and Demolitionist. This tier is for synergies that are constantly seen in the top 3 placements and are dominant in the meta. The first trait to talk about is Mercenary. This trait is essentially about how dominant Gangplank and Misfortune have become in the later stages of the game. Both champions do a ton of AoE damage, and it only gets better with each Mercenary upgrade you pick up for them. Without the Mercenary upgrades, these two champions are still perfectly viable, but having those upgrades is important for consistently getting top 3 finishes. Gangplank in particular has really taken over the meta at level 8 and 9, as he is the type of champion that can be played in multiple compositions just by himself. All he really needs is a Guardian Angel to make sure his ability goes off at least once. After that, any additional items on him are just a bonus. Make sure to pair him with another Demolitionist so that his ability not only does good AoE damage, but also stuns. Next up in the S tier, we have Valkyrie. Much like Mercenary, this trait is all about the champions more so than the trait itself. Misfortune, Kaisa, and Kale are all valued carries in the current meta, with Kale being extremely versatile. Kaisa is primarily played in Mech Infiltrator, but with how vital she is in that composition, it keeps her relevant in the meta. And Misfortune was already touched on in Mercenary, but the amount of damage she can do late game is absolutely absurd with both Valkyrie and any Mercenary upgrades. The Valkyrie trait itself is just the cherry on top of all the fantastic champions the trait has. Because it only requires 2 units, it's very easy to fit into any composition, which makes both the champions and the synergy itself quite flexible. And for the last synergy in S tier, we have Demolitionist. Demolitionist can be niche at times, but there's 2 main reasons why this belongs in the S tier. The first is that it is by far the best trait to turn another champion into using a spatula. Because of that, you're able to make certain champions extremely strong, such as Kaisa and Mech Infiltrator. The second reason is that Gangplank is currently one of the most sought after late game champions, and having a second Demolitionist for him is essential. Those reasons really make the trait shine in the current meta and make it a must-have if you're going to run a Gangplank or Mech comp. Okay, let's move on to the A tier, which consists of Brawler, Blaster, Celestial, Chrono, Mech-Pilot, Infiltrator, Blademaster, and Void. This tier is all about strong traits that you commonly see in top 4 compositions and are overall consistent. Up first is Brawler. Brawler is important because having a strong front line is necessary for any composition. Because this trait is a health increase, it's not as easy to counter as, say, Vanguard, which is weak against both magic damage and the item Last Whisper. While there are items such as Red Buff that do better against high health targets, or champions like Misfortune who does damage based on the target's health, there aren't a lot of weaknesses for Brawlers. The Brawler champions are also quite versatile, and whether it's 2 or 4 Brawler, you're likely to see the trait played in multiple meta comps. Moving on, we've got Blaster up next. Blaster remains a popular trait mainly due to Jinx and Misfortune. Jinx has fallen off slightly as a main carry, but is still a key champion in several builds, and to complement her, you're going to want at least one other Blaster. Misfortune we've talked about several times now, and as she has 2 easily splashed in traits, it makes sense to have both of them in when playing her. Overall, this trait isn't as reliant on 4 Blaster as it was in previous metas, but at every stage of the game, you can easily be running 2 of this synergy and you'll find it useful. Our next 2 traits are 2 premier splash traits you're going to want in most compositions, starting with Celestial. Celestial is a super common trait to splash in at later levels, as having a bit of healing for your team is quite valuable. Not only that, but a lot of the champions in this trait are viable in the meta, such as Xayah, Kassadin, Rakan, Lulu, and Ashe. Having multiple viable champions and being an easily splashed in 2-piece synergy makes the trait highly valued. The second splash trait you're going to see in almost every single game you play is Chrono. After going through a bit of a rework, this synergy has found its place as a fantastic splash trait. Generally, you're only going to run 2 Chrono, as getting that initial bump of attack speed is going to do the most, especially later in the game when team fights are quick. Much like Celestial, this synergy is just really easy to fit into the later stages of the game, especially since it has so many viable champions like Shen, Wukong, Thresh, and Blitzcrank. Even Caitlyn and Twisted Fate are valuable as one-cost champions throughout the game in the right compositions. Alright, it's time for the usual pair of traits, Mech-Pilot and Infiltrator. These two have remained a consistent threat in the meta, and even though the build of Mech-Infiltrator had its power reduced, it's still a key composition in the meta. Not much really needs to be said about these two traits that hasn't already been said. Although it is worth noting that Infiltrator has applications other than Mech-Infiltrator, as it's seen in Cybernetics with making Aurelia an Infiltrator, and also has had play in Void Brawler with Kha'Zix as one of the main carries. Nearing the end of A tier, we have Blademaster. This is a trait that you're going to see played a lot, as a lot of the champions are viable with both Xayah and Kayle as top tier carry champions. Overall, this trait is an essential part of multiple compositions, but is never really the main star of any particular build. And our last trait in the A tier is Void. Void is in an interesting position as Mana Printer was nerfed in 1010, but with buffs to Vel'Koz and players finding a way to make use of Kha'Zix 3 as a carry, it has remained a viable trait in the meta. The jury is still out on how consistent this synergy is, but at the moment it seems to be a top 4 trait when played in Void Brawler. Alright, let's move on to the B tier, which consists of Cybernetic, Mana Reaver, Sorcerer, Space Pirate, Rebel, Vanguard, and Sniper. This tier is all about strong plates that you may not play at every stage of the game, but are still valuable in the right situation. Kicking off B tier is Cybernetics. Cybernetics have definitely fallen out of favor as a 6-piece synergy, although you'll still see them played and they can still do well. The inconsistency of 6 Cybernetics is the main reason as to why they've fallen down to the B tier, but what keeps them afloat is how versatile the champions are and how common it is to see hybrid builds using 3 Cybernetics. Besides Echo, all of the other Cybernetics can be useful in the right composition, and having 3 in for the trait is a great addition. This trait is still consistent as a 3-piece, but be wary of going for 6 as it's much harder to pull off than in previous metas. Next up, we have Mana Reaver. Mana Reaver is, well, amazing, but it's also limited to the situations that you'll run it. Cassidy and Thresh do make this trait easier to play consistently, but overall the times you're going to want to run Mana Reaver are more niche than some other 2-piece traits like Celestial or Chrono. Sorcerers has fallen down in patch 1010 mainly due to there being less magic focused compositions. The trait itself is still useful and can be splashed in easily, but with Candyland being nerfed and Mana Printer not being as reliable, there's less reasons to have Sorcerer based comps. That said, it's still a fantastic trait and worth splashing if you're playing a more magic damage focused composition. Space Pirates is still doing well in the early game, but after that there really isn't much of a place for them. Space Jam is definitely a playable composition, though it's not reliable enough to force every game, and 4 Space Pirates are still struggling to work in the late game. The champions of this trait are still amazing, but as far as the trait goes, played in the early game for extra gold and then transition right out of it. Up next is Rebels. The synergy can be great if the right conditions are met, which basically means having Jinx 2 with carry items and Gangplank 2 with Mercenary upgrades. In that situation, it's a useful trait, although it's less about the trait itself and more about the champions. The inconsistency of this trait is why it's in the B tier, but overall it's still useful in the right circumstances. Nearing the end of the B tier, we have Vanguards. 2 Vanguards is still a strong early game synergy, but in general, it isn't as valuable or flexible as, say, Brawlers. That said, it's definitely worth running early game and having a second Vanguard to pair with Wukong later in the game. Lastly, for the B tier is Sniper. Sniper has been on the rise again with Jhin builds and Caitlyn as an important champion in the Shredder build, but this trait is still limited in where and when you want to play it. It basically is a trait dedicated only to Jhin, which is great when you're playing Jhin, but doesn't have much use outside of that situation. All right, we're nearing the end of the tier list, but first we have the C tier, which consists of Darkstar, Mystic, Protector, and Star Guardian. Basically, these are traits that are playable in niche situations, but overall aren't essential to play most of the time. Darkstar is the first up in C tier as a trait that has fallen off quite hard. While Xerath 2 is still a strong carry as well as Jhin, the trait itself isn't as important. Generally, if you want to run one or both of those champions, you can do so without the Darkstar trait, or if you do, it's likely only 3 Darkstars. Mystic is still a worthwhile splash trait in those situations that you really need it, but there are fewer times in the meta that you're really going to want to need Mystic, as magic damage compositions aren't as prevalent right now. That said, Karma was buffed drastically in 1010, so playing her with a carry can be worth it, and Lulu is always fantastic to run in the late game. Rakan and Jarvan really are good champions in the meta right now, but there really isn't much of a place for protectors as far as the synergy goes. It's a nice shield buff when you're running Rakan or Jarvan, but the impact of the trait overall is fairly negligible. The last trait in C tier is Star Guardian. Despite there being a small resurgence of the Star Guardian Sorcerer build, the fact remains that this trait just doesn't do enough to warrant it being higher in the tier list. Sorcerer as a synergy is vastly more important than Star Guardian, and Seraphs or Chalice can serve the same role as Star Guardian. Overall, this trait is just too niche, especially with the Candyland composition being weaker after it was nerfed. Our last tier and trait to go over is the D tier with the Lonely Starship. Honestly, Aurelion Sol isn't that bad when 2-starred with full items in a 6 rebel build, but it's just too specific, and oftentimes you have better results without him. Outside of rebels, you're almost never going to see an Aurelion Sol. Unfortunately, until he receives significant buffs or some type of rework, it looks like the D tier is going to remain the Starship tier. Alright folks, that is going to be it for today's tier list video. As you said in the introduction, the meta right now is quite diverse, so most of the traits are viable. It just depends on the composition and situation. Let us know in the comment section below which synergies you think should be higher or lower on the list. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future GiantSlayerTV videos.